Welcome to this lecture on Economies for Sustainable Welfare, Drawing from Alternatives. I am Tuuli Hirvilammi. I'm a senior researcher at Tampere University and currently working in a research project on systemic impacts and transition towards an eco-welfare state. You can find more information on research projects from these websites, both in Finnish and English. But today we will focus on welfare and economy, and especially drawing from alternatives. And first we will begin with the relationship between economy and well-being. How are actually economy and sustainable welfare and well-being connected, and human well-being in general? Here you see a figure that I've taken from the article that is published by ecological economist Robert Costanza with his colleagues, and in line with many other scholars, they have emphasized how actually economy with technology, politics and ethics are intermediate means operating in between of the natural environment, that is ultimate means, considering ultimate means, and between natural environment and ultimate ends, meaning human well-being. So economy is not an end as such. It's not something that we need to serve as human beings, but it's something that intermediates the natural environment and our overarching goal of prosperous, high quality of life. And what we mean with economy here is the two things: efficient allocation, that the economy needs to be built so that we can create and design a living economy, and then fair distribution to protect capabilities for flourishing or human needs for well-being. So this kind of systemic thinking that sees that well-being is the goal and the overarching goal and ultimate end of human life and our societies and public policies, and that the nature provides the foundation for well-being, and the economy is operating in between these ends and means as an intermediator. It's this same idea is present in Doughnut economics as well. This is a figure that's well known nowadays by Kate Raworth, British economist. And in this Doughnut economics, what is important is that the economy is operating within the safe and just space for humanity. And what this means, this safe and just space for humanity, is the space where we can function within the ecological ceiling. And with ecological ceiling, we can measure them by using these 9 planetary boundaries and trying to estimate what are the sustainable thresholds and boundaries that we should not exceed or transgress. And if we did transgress them, we would increase the risk that the globe and the ecosystems will not be anymore so beneficial for our well-being, and it's not so safe for us, and so there's an increasing risk for human population if we transgress these boundaries, and boundaries in terms of climate change, ocean acidification, ozone layer, air pollution, biodiversity loss, for example, and land conversion, and all these boundaries are connected, so that the bigger their interaction can cause some kind of irreversible ecological collapse or collapse in ecosystems. And if there is an overshoot, then the economy is not operating in sustainable terms. But also economy should provide social foundation for everybody. It's not enough if it functions well within the planetary boundaries, but also social justice needs to be taken into account. And here in this Doughnut model, social foundation refer to different needs and basic institutions that are that are necessary for human well-being, including water, food, health, education, income and work, energy, networks, housing, but also gender equality, political voice, and peace and justice, and equal societies in general. So if these kind of human needs and social foundations should also be guaranteed for everybody, and economy should function so that anyone is not lacking from this social foundation. So there is a poverty if these social achievements and social outcomes are not met, and there is an overconsumption and ecological unsustainability if these planetary boundaries are transgressed. And in between these two limits, there is a donut, so-called donut, and it means a regenerative and distributed economy. And this is a basic idea drawn that is inspired by systemic thinking, but also it's inspired by ecological economics. But what we often understand that there is this kind of donut, and this is it's more and more nowadays somehow in front that this we need to enhance this systemic thinking when considering economy, but also there is a growing critique towards capitalism and economic growth as such. Even Financial Times surprised many of us last year when they published this publication that emphasized how there is a need to rethink capitalism, and there is a time for reset, that we have to abandon this kind of the shareholders capitalism that is only seeking for short-term profit, and we have to rethink, and we have to go back to that kind of business model that can also serve longer-term sustainability goals, for example, and really reconsider what is the purpose of the economy as such. So that was very like a awakening call for many, for that even those more mainstream economic actors are now rethinking and calling for this kind of a new paradigm and new thinking patterns in terms of economy. And also different research reports are very strongly emphasizing the need to address this the question of economic growth and the growth paradigm. For example, here some quotations, and also natural scientists sees that the current limited paradigm of economic growth is the cause and one driver behind climate change and biodiversity loss, and therefore there is a need, if we want to build a sustainable future, there is a need to build a global sustainable economy and a new paradigm. So there is certainly a need to rethink economy, and it's more and more prominent, as I said, and more often announced. But I would say that the most fundamental question that we need to address if we want to rethink the economy is, of course, what is economy? And what all is included in economy, what we think, what we mean when we say that something is economy, that it's, if it's what comes to our mind, often maybe money, often we think something like stock markets and money and what we can buy from supermarkets. We think about production and consumption, we think about the exchange and the services, of course, but also possibly some farming and agriculture and bioeconomy in terms of forest production, for example. So those are the kind of stereotypical thoughts that come to our mind often if we think about economy. But I would say that it's very good to understand that there is not such a thing that the economy, that there are different meanings and different alternative approaches how to understand and how to answer the question, what is economy? So if you hear someone saying that the economy is saying that we have to save money, or the economic law says that we have to reduce something, and etc., you can always question that and reconsider who is this and what is this economy there behind this order or behind this argumentation. And I would say that referring to sociologists, for example, who have studied the economy, of course, and economists as well, we can understand that there are different meanings for economy. We can understand economy as a monetary exchange. For example, understanding that it refers to conditions for exchange, money, property rights, markets, and of course trust is always needed for exchange. For example, this is one approach, one angle to the question, what is economy? Then we can also approach it as production. As I already mentioned, we produce things, but it's also kind of metabolism between human-made products and the natural environment. If we understand that the natural environment is the ultimate mean and human well-being is the ultimate end, and economy is something that the sphere of life where we produce and where we exchange produce and consume, so that we exchange the nature to human-made artifacts, for example. And it's then of course related to labor and conditions for production, but also class structure and inequality. So it's very much also kind of some tangible, something that always requires energy and resources. And economy is also, it can be understood as institutions. It refers, of course, and it's built upon its different institutions, such as private property markets, banks, different kind of companies, and those institutions are of course then linked to regulation and legislation and rights. There are social and economic rights that are guaranteed by states and international organizations. But and those are human-made economic institutions that vary also in different countries in the world. So we can understand that there can be different alternative institutions and not just one certain model how to organize these institutions. So, but they are always social institutions and social also patterns that somehow govern these institutions. But they are also connected to cultural meanings and values and ideologies and these kind of ideas that influence behind the political actors and in the background of economic policies as well. So economy can be understood also that it also has this kind of meaning that is present in our discourses. It's something that we use when we frame things, if they are efficient or productive. We think about education as a social investment, for example, that really strongly refers that we use this kind of monetized and economic language as well. And when the language, if we understand language, it always contains some power use as well. So economy is also embedded in our cultural meanings in many ways. And we structure the economy while using different discourses and different meanings in our language. So it's a very multiple field that what opens when we start to reconsider and consider what is economy as such. And it's weird that often still economy is approached as this kind of small circle. And this is very basic, simplified idea what neoclassical approach has taught us, that okay, economy is something that happens between firms and households. We exchange goods and services. We, as individuals, as household members, we provide factors for production for firms, and then we get wage, and then we can purchase some consumer products. And this is the very basic idea that there is a money circulation, and this kind of microeconomic field and very basic illustration, of course. But what is missing from this picture, and what is nowadays more and more emphasized, is of course all the energy, where it comes from, and all of resources and all like individuals and all people who are acting within this picture, all their behavioral patterns that are missing and all choices that they are making. So this is very simplified, and ecological economics is one answer that tries to say, try to enlarge the picture from small circle to bigger circle, where we see that this kind of small circle is embedded in the environment, in the ecosystems, in biosphere. And here, what is emphasized and what is the kind of main message of ecological economics is to understand how the economy is embedded in this kind of biophysical system, and it always depends on energy and materials and on the availability of different things. That the waste goes somewhere. There has to be some natural or human-made things that, for example, absorb the emissions. And it always the production and economic institutions always need some kind of energy, and of course, in the first place, it comes from sun. And different inputs, natural resources and energy, and when we produce something in that small circle, or if macroeconomy is included, so also public actors are included in the bigger circles and smaller circles, whatever we produce, we always create some waste. So there is this kind of input throughput output model, and the focus is on this material and energy throughput in this systemic understanding. And ecological economics is a research field that has been growing and developed since 1970s, and there are pioneering researchers, including Georges Kurogen and Costanza, as I mentioned, and Herman Daly, for example, who has developed this steady state economy concept. So this is, and this nowadays is ecological economics. The research is used when in evaluation of ecosystem services, for example, and when counting on material flows of energy economy or carbon footprints, for example. So this basic idea is nowadays very, very often present, and it's always kind of the very foundational idea behind the ecological economics is, of course, the acknowledgement and understanding of the very close human-nature relationship, or actually the kind of intertwined social ecological system, where economy is always embedded in society and biosphere. So this kind of strong sustainability notion, and also relational notion, in the sense that it's quite artificial to try to draw a line between society and biosphere. We are, as human beings, it's difficult to separate us from the nature, and we are always dependent on the nature. And our social system is something where the economy is also taking place. So this kind of more broad social ecological perspective has helped us to enlarge the notion of small circle to bigger ecological economic circle, and it has also led us to understand how important it is to develop the economies from linear to circular models, so that the throughput is, of course, we have to consider it so that we create as less waste as possible, and we have to circulate the material we use. And here are just some, it's also a picture from Kate Raworth where she calls this kind of butterfly figure, or butterfly economy, where we have to restore, repair, reuse, refurbish, and recycle all material in the production and consumption, a kind of chains of production and consumption. So it's these also these quite new innovations of linear circular economy that are already taking place in growing amount. They have kind of inspired and and actually they are based on this research on ecological economics, and have very much benefited from the research discussion on ecological economics to highlight the systemic thinking. And maybe due to increasing circular economy and due to more strict carbon or climate policies in recent years, we are now witnessing this kind of declining carbon emissions in advanced countries. World Energy Association, International Energy Association, has written that global energy-related carbon emissions have flattened in 2019, and this has resulted mainly from a sharp decline in CO2 emissions from the power sector in advanced economies. So especially the power sector has been successful in declining carbon emissions, so maybe it's not so much due to circular economy, and there are some explaining factors include expanding role of renewable sources, so we use more wind and solar. We have switched from coal to natural gas, and we use more nuclear power. So there is a trend of declining carbon emissions in advanced countries if we look at this power sector that takes place within the countries. But when we consider consumption-based emissions and we consider trade and include trade, then we see that the carbon footprints in European countries do exceed the planetary boundaries. And we are not following the climate targets of 2 degrees global warming. So there is certainly a need of decouple the GDP from energy use, from emissions, and from material use. And if we look at the declining carbon emissions, we can see that, okay, maybe there are some signs of decoupling in European countries, in advanced countries, in rich countries, if we look at the domestic emissions. But if we change the estimate and the environmental indicator to material use, we also see that when we look at the domestic consumption, material consumption, this red line in this figure, we can see some decoupling, meaning that the GDP has increased while material consumption has decreased. So these two lines go like to different directions. Then that is the basic idea of decoupling and the very aim of the policy goal of decoupling emissions and environmental harm from GDP growth. But if we look at the material footprint indicator, that includes also consumption-based material like trade and international, like all material we use. For example, in Finland, if we buy some products that are imported from whatever, China, for example, then if we count that material use and all those material throughput that has been that is needed along the production chain in that certain product, if we consider those and take into account that material use, then we see that actually the material use is increasing even more. It's increasing more than GDP use in Europe countries, in European countries, and it has been the same in USA and OECD. So this article by Jason Hickel and Yorgos Kallis, they conclude that the material intensity of the world economy has been increasing and not decreasing. So it's opposite with the policy goal of decoupling. And instead of dematerialization or immaterialization of economy, they actually call it as rematerialization. And it's kind of surprising. Instead of all service economy that we have moved from manufacturing economy and industry to service economy, the share of services of GDP has increased, but still it has not managed to lower the material throughput of the economy, because also services, they require quite a lot of material to produce. And for example, if dentists, for example, earn her living by providing this service, but then she still use the wage for something that requires material and natural resources. So it's not like important, and always the kind of this kind of rebound effect then compensate, and the material, maybe the save of material use. So maybe the services are not going to provide any sustainable solution, but what is really needed is lower the demand of natural resources. So it means that we have to demand the consumption and production, decrease the consumption and production. And what is needed also is to lower the emissions, of course, along the IPCC trajectories. But when we know the challenge of decoupling, and we know the challenge of economic growth, and the relationship between growth, the historical relationship between GDP growth and economic environmental harm, and in these different environmental indicators, it's quite nowadays quite often said that we should maybe achieve and try to achieve some kind of degrowth. And what we mean with degrowth, first of all, we can, with many good reasons, argue that the age of economic growth is coming to an end. This has been often said in the context of rich countries, where the productivity of economy has not increased or developed so heavily anymore. And it has been said that it's quite difficult to imagine where the productivity kind of loop could come anymore, even though digitalization and artificial intelligence, they might provide some new avenues, we don't know. And it's possible that in the future there will be abundant renewable energy, but it's also true that oil and coal, and especially oil, has been very kind of unique source of energy, fossil fuel that has been easy to transport and store, and it has been cheap and achievable and everywhere. So if we move from oil and we move from fossil fuels to renewables, it's possible that we won't see the rapid economic growth anymore. But this is a disputed topic. But anyway, it seems that it's more difficult to get to achieve those higher consumption rates anymore. Also, there can be that there is this kind of saturation level of consumption already. There is an assumption that growth above a level that satisfies basic needs does not improve psychological well-being anymore. It's called a kind of Easterlin paradox. It's also disputed where this level is and how many dollars per year, for example, one needs to earn where before the level comes. And maybe that's not important, but it seems that the consumption, ever increasing consumption, is not always and forever serving our well-being anymore, and subjective well-being and life satisfaction or happiness. So that's also one reason why it's maybe not so wise to try to achieve economic growth or GDP growth anymore. So there is a critique towards the culture of greed within the degrowth discussion. Degrowth is a research field. It's an academic scholarship, but it's also kind of a field of activism, activism-inspired research, probably. but it's also a very vivid and topical research discussion, international research. And it's also the degrowth discourse and discussion research also criticize that growth requires continuous monetizing of goods and services, and therefore it's not sustainable. It means that we take those kind of areas of life, such as care or education or like household work or something, to the sphere of economy and monetized economy, because we try to get as much growth as possible. So we try to monetize and get them to the GDP field of economy, and it's not sustainable like anymore. Or people think that it needs to be like somehow protected from the ever increasing sphere of economic growth. But what we mean with degrowth in this research, for example, Tim Jackson in his famous book called Prosperity Without Growth has provided some definitions of the degrowth. I refer here to Francois Schneider, who with his colleagues, they have defined degrowth as an equitable downscaling of production that increases well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the local and global level in the short and long term. So at the same time, it means downscaling of production and especially environmental impact, but at the same time, the aim is to increase well-being and take care of social justice. And then, therefore, it's not so important what happens to GDP as such. It's not only degrowth is not advocating a kind of economy where GDP has to be negative or something, but it's more kind of agnostic approach that the priorities have to be on well-being, ecological sustainability, and social justice instead of growth as such. So whatever, this is kind of systemic idea that the economy needs to serve these priorities instead of that well-being, and the social justice needs to serve the growth, and vice versa is taking place maybe nowadays. At least that is something that is argued in degrowth discussion, where the mainstream hegemonic growth paradigm and growth addiction or growth fetishism is criticized. But it's also important to understand that degrowth doesn't mean, it's not kind of universal approach that all countries should follow the same degrowth path of transition. But it's understood that degrowth is a kind of temporary phase. It's a path toward lower steady state economy. And in rich countries where we exceed the planetary boundaries and we have over consumption, kind of excess, we can reduce. We have to leave space for the poorer countries where there is still poverty and like lack of the kind of social foundations in the Doughnut model, for example. So that is kind of a justice-oriented argumentation that there are different approaches, and degrowth requires this kind of global redistribution of resources and global justice, and maybe planetary justice, one could say. And what degrowth then means, it's of course disputed how feasible it is and what kind of policy solutions could lead us to degrowth. But very important is to understand that the degrowth is not the same with economic recession. Recession is harmful often. It increases social injustice. It can be very bad for the most vulnerable groups in society, and therefore degrowth needs to be something that is simply different. It's not the recession, but simply different. And how to achieve what we mean with simply different in that this discussion or research. What has been suggested include, for example, taxation on resources, different environmental taxes. Then basic income is quite often referred to. and in addition to basic income, there could be also maximum income or maximum level of resource use, somehow defined a maximum set in line with this Doughnut thinking that there needs to be both limits. And work time reduction is also often mentioned as one possible policy solution that could help to decrease the carbon emissions or emissions and material throughput, but at the same time possibly increase well-being in different ways, because people would have more time with their relatives and family members. But then, of course, it needs to be done so that it doesn't increase the poverty somehow equal way. Then also, besides the work time reduction, also job guarantee has been suggested. It means a kind of institution where state or municipalities as public authorities could guarantee kind of last resort job or workplace to all people, so that despite the decreasing consumption and production, there should be work and income for everyone somehow guaranteed and provided by public authorities. And then it's also widely acknowledged that within the present monetary system, we can't achieve sustainable development goals or whatever sustainability goals. The sustainable economy always requires or would require some kind of reform in our monetary system. Instead of present monetary system where the money creation is in the hands of private banks, increasing debt in general economy, there could be some institutions, and so that we get better, that we have more public control over the money, the creation of money, for example, through central banks or different social or green bonds. And also, alternative currencies could be used, complementary currencies, local currencies, different credit systems, time banks. Those are often suggested as well. And then degrowth researchers are interested in commons, commoning in terms of governing together the common resources and organizing the commons institutions where we govern how we share the commons, not only like natural commons and like resources, but also knowledge and different public services, like social services could be also considered as commons that we have to take care of their value instead of monetizing them and privatizing them. So these are, for example, some discussions that often are present in degrowth research. And along with the same line as drawing from similar kind of inspirations and sources of inspirations, also Kate Raworth suggests in her very good book, Doughnut Economics, that we need to rethink at least these 7 fields. And she has provided this kind of map from 20th century economics to 21st century economics. First, we need to change the goal from GDP to Doughnut and see the big picture. As I also mentioned, instead of this small circle, we should see this embedded economy. And it's also this new economy building, or more sustainable economy, would also require that we rethink who we are as human beings. Are we rational economic men or men, homo economicus, who are only driven by self-interest and rational mind, who wants to take care of own profit only? Or are we more like socially adaptable humans, community members? Are we relational beings that are always connected to each other and dependent on ecosystems, but also on other people. And this view, this changed view on like we as humans is very important when building a new sustainable economy. And instead of this kind of quite mechanical demand and supply curves, we should understand more dynamic complexity, different systems interacting, and what are the feedback loops and the feedback mechanisms between different exchange and markets. Anyway, this kind of dynamic and systemic thinking instead of mechanical thinking, that's very important in sustainable economy. And then Raymond also emphasized that instead of this kind of growth-driven economy, neoclassical economy, where we think often that if the wealth increases, then we can afford to share it. That only when we have increased the wealth, we can afford to distribute. But actually, the economy could be distributive by design. That is something that Ray was suggests. That instead of waiting that the economic benefits will trickle down to the poorest people, that we could implement some kind of fair trade principles and more like responsible corporations who already consider the distributive impacts and the fair distribution in the very principle of the economic interaction. And instead of trusting that we can have economic growth, and then in the end or after a certain level we can afford to clean the environment, we could have this kind of more regenerative, linear, circular economy by design. And this is again quite revolutionary somehow when you think that now often it's argued that for example poor countries, they have local environmental problems because they are not rich enough to protect their environment, and then after a certain level, like a state of the development, they can afford to have environmental policies and more like clean their environment. But that's not empirically valid argument anymore, and we should instead create to regenerate the economy, the environment. And again, the question of growth, also Ray would suggest that instead of being growth addicted, we should be growth agnostic and prioritize the well-being and the safe and just operating space for humanity. I addressed the question of what is economy in the beginning of this lecture, and now I will answer this question from two more perspectives to draw from alternatives. So I suggested that from ecological economics perspective, we have to consider the broader picture, the ecological embeddedness of economy. But if we answer this question from feminist economics perspective, we also would advocate a broader approach to economy. And here you see a birthday cake and a puzzle, and you might wonder what are these and what they do have to do with economy. But the feminist economists have provided this kind of very nice illustrations and figures to emphasize how important it is to understand the broader, like not only market economy or this GDP monetized economy, but also natural economy, household economy, unpaid community economy, illegal economy, etc. And this cake picture, I think, quite nicely and also aptly concretized somehow how important it is that this household caring economy takes place, and only on top of the caring and unpaid work that is often done in households, we can build these monetized private and public sector economic actors. And if there are not workers that are cared for, there are not economic profit. So this feminist economics takes a more holistic approach and tries to factor all activities that currently fall outside the mainstream economic sphere. And along the same lines, the similar lines, really much drawing from this feminist economics, you can see the concept of community economies under development at the moment. It originates from Australian, from two authors, Gibson Graham, and they have developed, along with many scholars nowadays, community economies concept that refer to the ongoing democratic co-creation of the diverse ways in which we collectively make our livings, receive our livings from others, and provide for others in turn. And there also the very basic idea of this iceberg of community and diverse economies is to show the diversity. And here also the basic idea is that we only see often this peak of iceberg. We see the wage labor and commodity markets and capitalist enterprise, but what remains to be undervalued somehow under the surface are all these daily practices take place in like self-organized manners and non-hierarchical relations, and they are based on more direct interactions than often in mainstream economy, where the interactions and links can be quite indirect and also not so transparent. So this tries to make visible again the households, again the different ecosystem services also that we are dependent on, for example, soil and nutrition and whatever. It's the basic idea is to show the diversity. And the diversity is also when we think about the market and wage and the transactions and labor and enterprise, that there in these spheres also we often consider that transactions would mean market, but there are alternative markets as well. For example, markets that use alternative currencies, cooperatives. There are barter markets and local trading systems that have been existing in all cultures. So it's always important also to remember that we can't get rid of economy. Economy is always part of human communities, and community economy also the concept very nicely emphasizes the thing that economy is something that is in our daily life, and it's very fundamental to well-being. And it's not very aptly said that we have to get rid of economy. Instead, we have to broaden maybe the understanding of where the economic value or value for human well-being is produced and what are the different ways. So not only wage labor, but there can be also alternative paid labor and work that happens in also families, but also in communities and cooperatives. And not only capitalist enterprise exist, but there are also different enterprises, like enterprises, for example, socially responsible firm, and this socially responsible corporation is of course also a growing phenomenon. So it's increasing interest in this kind of more not so profit-seeking enterprise structure. And there are different community economies, mostly in maybe poorer countries where they are necessary for well-being in many ways, but also in richer countries, in welfare state, there are grassroots movements who are building this kind of alternative community economy, or it can be called solidarity economy often as well. And what is solidarity economy? Is a value-centered alternative economy. It's a grassroots economy built by the people, for the people and the planet. This is the definition by the solidarity economy movement. And they also, the values, what they follow are self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. And they very much emphasize the deeper approach to democracy, participatory approach, direct democracy or deliberation, what is very important, dialogues, etc. And maybe I show you this kind of map that is created by solidarity economy researcher, Ethan Miller, and with many local actors as well. But this map of solidarity economy illustrates well that what is centered in the solidarity economy are the needs, is the human well-being, the local needs, the community, what needs to be produced and somehow guaranteed in the economy. Maybe at least education, energy, health, food and water, shelter, community members, and sphere of this kind of spirit of community. And then there are different ways to produce, to exchange, to consume, to allocate the surplus, and to create the value. And instead of, and this also enlarges our imagination, what all is included in economy. There are different grassroots do-it-yourself movements already taking place in many countries. There are different not-for-profit collectives. Self-employment, of course, is increasing, and it can be also sustainable. Producer cooperatives, there are also housing cooperatives and consumer cooperatives, so that people can produce and consume differently. They can be member of, for example, community-based agriculture cooperatives that try to somehow not have so clear separation between consumer and producer. And then there are different exchange systems, again using, for example, community currencies. And then this how to allocate surplus. There are different financing systems, credit unions, cooperative banks, but also these green bonds and social bonds. And it's also a growing field of activism to develop these kind of alternatives. And collective ownership of land is, of course, something that is also very old idea, but I don't know how much implemented in this movement. But anyway, I would say that these alternatives do exist, and they take place already also in European countries. And in Finland, here are pictures from Finnish community economic cases and solidarity economic actors, Omama, Food Cooperative, and Hirvitalo, for example. It's kind of a center for contemporary art in Tampere, which is quite alternative. And they try to build the kind of alternative economy in grassroots level. And it remains to be seen what is the significance of these alternatives, and when do we see the paradigm shift really taking place in the economy. There are a lot of signs now that there will be a new paradigm ahead. At least there is a lot of sign of rethinking and need to reconsider what is economy, and a lot of alternatives have been developed, but it very much remains to be seen how feasible and plausible are these alternatives, and yes, how they can address the current challenges of ecological crisis. But I hope that this was inspiring, and we will find good answers to what is sustainable economy. Thank you.